Hey everyone, welcome back to Rushing the Field. I'm Nicole Auerbach. He's Joshua Perry. And Joshua, everyone's fighting still. They're arguing about CFP expansion. There's like two things happening in college sports, and this is one of them. The commissioners can't come to agreement. You know, I had a topic in our rundown for this show, and I said nothing is going to happen, like no resolution out of the latest commissioners meeting. And then you know what? That's what happened.
It's so fun. Like I say all the time, sports, reality television, they're one and the same for me. I feel like I'm watching like the Andy Cohen show that comes on like after the Housewives shows, where everybody's just like throwing shade and making their comments and like stirring the pot. And that's kind of where we're at. Like nothing seems to be happening, but everybody has a take on it. And coaches are talking, players are talking. And like I'm at the point right now where I'd like to see the resolution because it's a lot of bluster.
I would love to see a Watch What Happens Live type show. Actually, Andy would be great for this, like to get the commissioners around a little round table, coffee table, because you know what they do at these meetings? They like escape to the elevators. They don't talk. They don't like give their own thoughts on this. And all you end up getting is Rich Clark, the executive director of the CFP, who, by the way, said, so this is a Wednesday meeting. They're in Asheville, North Carolina. The commissioners do like a summer meeting at like a very nice resort. They went to the Biltmore, which is beautiful. And also, do we need to spend the money? I have a lot of questions about that. Well, these were the comments from Rich Clark. He says, quote, "I wouldn't say there's a leading contender right now for them, but they're taking a good look and a fresh look at it. The format could be a lot different in 2026, or it might be the same." So that is, we could be back at the very beginning of this conversation, or maybe we will have an answer by the fall. So Rich Clark was saying that these commissioners would like to have an answer on like, hey, do we want to change the format for 2026 through 2031, basically the length of the new contract for the CFP by the fall. Now, they actually have a hard deadline, December 1st, with ESPN, if they're going to change something for next season. Now, by the way, for anyone listening, if you got confused, listen, I get it. People are always trying to change things while other things are happening. This year, it's just going to be the normal 12-team playoff. They fix the seeding, straight seeding, 1 through 12. We're talking about next season, and that's when the new contract begins. The thing is, the Big Ten and the SEC have control over this format, but they have to agree. And right now they don't agree. And this is what's fascinating when you talk about reality TV. The dynamic at play is really interesting because the last year, everyone in college sports has been really nervous and kind of terrified of the Big Ten and the SEC working together. And now Big Ten wants multiple AQs. They want the idea of like a play-in tournament at the end of the season, but they're the ones pushing this like 4 AQs for the Big Ten and the SEC, 2 for the Big 12 and the ACC, and then 1 for the group of 5, and then at large spots. SEC goes into the SEC meetings. There's a lot of agreement with the Big Ten on the administrative side. The coaches are like, no, we want a 5+11 model, AQs for each, 1 for each of the leagues, and 11 at large spots, because the SEC is a grind. It's really hard. Right. We think we can get more than 4 teams, which again is a minimum. Anyway, it all kind of implodes. And I will tell you that I've had multiple conversations with people in Big Ten country that were not happy at all. And we're really surprised by what happened at the SEC meeting. So now you have this rift. Like, I almost think it's a standoff, a standstill. And Joshua, part of it stems from the fact that the SEC plays 8 conference games, while the Big Ten plays 9. And so the Big Ten does not want to support an at-large heavy model if they think their teams are playing a harder schedule than the SEC. So the SEC has an easier path.
Right. And I do want to clarify, because some of the reporting, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the reporting makes it sound like the Big Ten would be more open to entertaining the 5+11 model if the SEC went to the 9th conference.
Yes, game. They are. And they are. Yeah. They are. Yeah. Yes. But the SEC hasn't done it. Right. So the Big Ten wants to do like the format. The SEC wants to figure out its league schedule. Right. So like it's like kind of a chicken or the egg situation.
Which is absolutely insane. I
Right.
feel
But the
like part
SEC
of
coaches don't want the extra game because that's extra
Of course
losses.
not. No, of course they wouldn't want to do that. And they've stood on business for that for a while, and until there's like a genuine like financial incentive for them to do it, or to your point, like if they can guarantee that they still have the same access to the college football playoff by adding that extra game, that's going to be the thing for them. What makes this weird to me is how quickly the tone shifted from the SEC. And I think part of the reason why this feels like a standoff now and it feels like there's, this tension is because like nobody likes being surprised. Nobody likes reading the reports and learning new information when you're supposed to be working together and when you've had conversations in the background together. So that's one thing that really stands out to me about this and the way that the SEC has kind of moved through it. The other thing, and this is just like my thoughts on the different models, and I've been pretty consistent in saying that I hate automatic qualifiers. I also hate this idea of we need to continue to expand the college football playoff. The sport was great when the polls were picking the champion. The sport was great when we had computers doing it. The sport was great when we had a 4-team playoff. And frankly, it was great last year the way it was, right? So we don't need to keep doing this thing. I would caution the Big 12 and the ACC in feeling like the 5+11 model is better for them because of the idea that they can get more teams with the at-large. I'm not exactly sure that it's going to go the way that they think it might. We've seen the way that the committee has kind of given favor and deference and the way that teams are viewed, and we can talk about analytics and everything else. A lot of the analytic models right now skew toward the SEC anyway.
Right.
I feel like they might be setting themselves up to only have the one team in certain years when they could have had a guaranteed two. That's where a lot of the back and forth is going to come in with the decision making. These models, depending on how it goes down, the Big Ten and the SEC are likely to be fine. It's just how everybody else ends up in this thing.
I think that's a really good point because if you do the math, which I haven't done it all out, but I've been told by everyone who has done the math for the last decade that the guaranteed 2 spots actually is better, at least for one of those leagues. But we have seen
like
ACC over the last decade very top heavy. It would just be Clemson and everybody else. We've seen it in the Big 12 last year, and we're going to see it moving forward, really bunched up. So yeah, your champion's going to have a spot, but is your second and third ranked team going to be even close enough to make the playoff? These are going to be the questions. So yeah, part of the argument is like you should take 2, even if you're accepting at the start of the season, our league is capped at 2, your league is capped at 4. So therefore, like, you're worthy of more access, more spots because your league is better than us. That's what the ACC and the Big 12 don't want to admit, right? They don't want to agree to that. And I think that would be very difficult for them. But that's where we are. And I think the idea of the extra at larges, if you're the SEC, they have always had this stance. Like, it doesn't matter what the size of the playoff is. We're going to be fine. We're going to get our teams in. And you're right. Like, the metrics favor them. The way we view the SEC, certainly the SEC champion, it's going to lead to that. And even the Big Ten, you do the math, is going to get multiple teams in. They'll get them in as at larges. They want to build in other elements. They want this play-in tournament. They want, if you have a play-in tournament for the 3rd and 4th spots, you go 3rd place team versus 6th place team, 4th place team versus 5th place team, whatever it is. That helps the middle of the league. That helps the bottom of your league get better. You have something to play towards and play up into, because that's been the problem in the Big Ten. You've had years where there's 2 good teams, maybe 3 good teams, and then there's a big drop off. So I see why the Big Ten wants that, but that's why you want the designated spots. You also want that so you could say, hey, go play an SEC challenge, go do these things. It's okay if you take extra losses because we're guaranteed 4 spots. That's what the difference between the AQs and the at-larges. Whereas the SEC is like, whatever, we'll get a lot of teams in. And right now we're at 8 conference games. We don't have to go to 9, and we're still going to get a lot of teams in.
Right. And I'll say this too for the Big Ten angle of it. What we saw based off of last year with conference championship games, That inventory on the television side is not what it used to be. And when you think about a TV contract, the networks are not necessarily paying for the ability to have Rutgers versus Maryland. And I'm not trying to take shots. It's just like, it is what it is, right? Like they're paying for some of the marquee matchups, right? We had Ohio State and Oregon last year on our network. Like that was a big deal. Fox pays to have Ohio State, Michigan every year. And part of that is you pay to have a conference championship game that has big implications. It's a huge matchup. It was a snooze fest. Nobody cared last year because all the teams were basically in. And so when you're starting to pitch to TV networks the next time around, what are we going to do about this? Because the postseason format screwed us on our ability to have an exciting conference championship game to broadcast. You can say, well, actually, we've got this play-in tournament on the weekend for the last couple of spots for our AQs. And I think that's part of this too. When you think about all of the business that goes into this, they're trying to protect what the TV inventory looks like toward the end of the year too.
Right. And that's something that's happened in the last few years. Like, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12, rest in peace. Like everyone went and hired business executives who are looking out for what's best for their individual conferences. So the Big 10 is thinking what is best for the Big 10, right? And our media partners, our deals. And that's what's different about this conversation. I will say it's very tribal too. So like I went to a media event with Illinois and Brett Bielema the other day, and he was going to sing the 7th inning stretch. Like, I actually don't know if he was worried about it. Him and Luke Altmaier were doing a duet. He said they were going to practice a little bit, wasn't making any huge promises. He said he'd rather do that, by the way, than throw out the first pitch, which was very surprising. I thought that like Bielema could.
The first pitch is a lot of pressure.
It is a lot of pressure. I did it at a minor league game. I was so nervous about it. Like it is, too. But singing in front of like 40,000 people too. So before that though, he talked to reporters and he took some jabs at the SEC. And listen, like he's the one coach that is doing that for the Big Ten. I think it's healthy to have that healthy back and forth, but he'll go back at Lane Kiffin. We obviously remember what happened with their bowl game against South Carolina. So he gets asked about kind of where the CFP debate is. And he says, I don't think there's any way we could do a 16-team playoff if the SEC is not at 9 conference games. We voted unanimously as Big Ten coaches to stay at 9 league games and actually maybe add an SEC challenge. I was told that they voted unanimously to stay at 8 and not play the Big Ten. But then some people pop off and say what they want to say because they want to look a certain way. That was a reference to Brian Kelly talking about wanting to play the Big Ten and different challenges that they would support there. So he's making that point for Tony Petitti, for the Big Ten. That's like, hey, these two things are connected. Like we do not want to expand the playoff to more at-large spots if you guys aren't going to be even in terms of league games. And I get that. And so that's where like we're at a standstill. And so Joshua, like as I'm listening to Brett Bielema and talk to him about it, and then as I'm thinking about it, as I've had conversations this week, I got myself to a point where I wrote a column, it's on NBCsports.com, where I'm like, this is a blessing in disguise. That we're now in a world where 2 leagues get to determine the playoff format. They don't agree right now. They're at a standstill. You got to do this before we'd agree to that. Well, I don't want to do that unless you do this, right? Well, you know what that might lead to? That might lead to us having the 12-team playoff. Continuing onward forward. And you know what? 12-team playoff works pretty great, right? Like the only issue that it had last year was the weird convoluted way they did the seeding, and they fixed that. So why not just live in the world that they made? It took them years to get to the point of having a 12-team playoff with 5 conference champion spots and 7 at-large spots. And it worked really well. And you know what else we learned? And I know you agree with me, Joshua. There are not 12 teams that are capable of winning a national championship. So we don't need to go to 14 or 16 to make sure that we include the team that can win it all. That's not going to happen. There were about 6, right? I think in a normal year, you'll have 6 to 8. But that's not a good enough argument just to go to 14 or 16. And the reason that people want to do that is just because they have big leagues and they need more spots for their teams to land. You know what? That's not a good enough reason. 12 works really, really well. And I think that this might end up, this standstill, if they don't agree on anything to change by December 1st, we're going to stay at 12. And I think that's the way to do it. Like if we're having issues, let's pause. Let's not go round and round in circles on this debate. Let's just stay where we are. We've been for 1 year. We don't need to fix something that doesn't need fixing.
I'm going to get myself in trouble by saying this, but I think that there are a lot of people based off of things that we hear out in the world that understand that more access doesn't necessarily mean that more people are capable, right? Like these are things that folks have told me for some years now on some certain topics. So this idea of keep expanding, like part of the thing that I think I have always appreciated about college football is that there's exclusivity in being able to like pursue being a champ. The thing that bothers me about the NFL is you'll look at a team that is like barely over 500 and they get in the playoffs and like because that's a parity league, they actually have a real shot. And I'm like, they didn't even do the work in the regular season, right? Like I felt like in this sport, you had to do the work in the regular season. And yeah, it sucks because it only feels like a small amount of teams can actually do it. Well, 16 out of 130 some odd teams still isn't a lot of teams in the first place, right? Like we didn't really open this thing up all that much when you start to play out ratios. And the reality of the situation is none of those teams are going to win it anyway. I bring this point back all the time we have this discussion. The college football playoff, as it stands right now, benefits a team like Ohio State, who lost to the best team that was on their schedule and screwed around their rivalry game and lost and still had a chance to be in the postseason. It benefits a team like Notre Dame, who is obviously very talented with a great young head coach who had the worst loss in college football a year ago, and they still get to pursue a championship. But this is not, it was not built for Boise State, and it was not built for SMU. They get to feel good about their inclusion. For the inclusion, but for the actual ability to win a championship. And this is not hate because I like both of those teams and I appreciate their path. Their rosters are not built to do what Ohio State's roster did, to do what Penn State's roster did, to do what Notre Dame's roster did. And that's where this is asinine. So I agree with you. I'd actually go a step further. I'd like to roll it back, but we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. But I agree with this idea of why not just let 12 ride for a little bit? Why not just sit in the moment that we're in? Because it ended up working out pretty well. We got to see some exciting games. We had the access people were talking about. And frankly, it does feel like we had the right teams that were able to progress through the bracket. But moving to 16 does nothing for me.
All right, we will table our conversation of expansion for just a second. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it. It's one of the main off-season topics, but so is the House settlement, which finally got approved by Judge Claudia Wilkin. There's so much to get into this. We're going to bring in an expert, my pal Justin Williams from The Athletic, when we come back. Joshua and I are back with Justin Williams from The Athletic. Justin, one of my good friends, also a fellow reality TV watcher, Joshua, just so
I love that.
You all know. Actually, before we start, I need to know, are you guys watching Love Island?
We haven't started it yet, but it's on the list.
That's not one that I've ventured into.
Joshua, you'd love it.
I'll put it on the list.
I'll say, is it messy? my wife's scale is like the messier the better. So
then perfect. You guys need to get into it. It's a big time commitment, but it's worth it. I promise. Speaking of messy though, like we're in a messy era of college sports. And that's why we wanted to bring you on, Justin, because I know you've been so far in the weeds on the House settlement as it was awaiting a final approval, roster limits conversation, but also now that it's here, now that it's finally approved, how it's all actually going to work in terms of like, you got to report deals. We've got Title IX lawsuits about the back pay damages. There's so much that's going on. But I want to start with this for our listeners who maybe their eyes have glazed over when they've seen headlines about this. Maybe they have skipped forward when Joshua and I have talked about this. Who knows? No judgment. What exactly does the House settlement do? Looking backwards and also looking forwards.
Yeah, so it all kind of started because of the backwards piece. And that's the part, even though we're starting with it, where I understand if people's eyes glaze over, which is, there is 2.8 billion people have probably seen that number. That's all back pay damages to former college athletes. I think, Joshua, you just missed the cut, right?
I just started missed the cutoff.
I know. Starting in 2016. So basically 2016 until 2021 when NIL was allowed, because of the statute of limitations, these former athletes sued and are now getting back pay. So it's coming from the power conferences and the NCAA. That's the big number. But really for fans and people that are paying attention to the sport right now, moving forward, the biggest thing, and honestly, the headline is schools can start directly paying college athletes on July 1st. It'll be $20.5 million year one. But, basically this whole century of amateurism in college sports that had kind of gone away with NIL, now like it's completely gone. Schools are directly giving money to athletes.
So where do you see the biggest pivots when you talk to administrators? Because you've got scholarship, you've got roster limits in here, and then obviously there's the fundraising aspect of this. So how are administrators talking about this lawsuit finally being settled?
Yeah, for the vast majority of schools, even power conference schools, the biggest thing is that $20.5 million revenue sharing pool. That's a new budget item. And so most of these schools are figuring out, how do we get that? Where does that come from? It's coming from, more fundraising. It's coming from, we've seen places like Tennessee's putting a talent fee on their ticket prices, and Arkansas's raising concession prices. So some of this is getting passed on to the fans, unfortunately. There's people that they're just changing their budget. They're making cuts. They're, not making as many hires as they maybe had planned to internally. A bunch of different things. But for the most part, these schools are like, how do we get to $20.5 million a year? There are also those schools at the very top, the ones that have the $200 million athletics budgets anyways, Ohio State, Texas, Oregon. We all kind of know what they are. These are the ones that are interesting because they're not going to have nearly as much trouble getting to that $20.5 million, probably at the top of the Big Ten and the SEC. But now there's this question of this NIL clearinghouse and the settlement trying to get rid of the wild, wild west of NIL and collective payments. And are these schools going to be okay spending the same amount as everyone else in the power conferences or otherwise? As my colleague and our friend Ralph Russo put it, is Syracuse football going to spend as much as Ohio State football moving forward? That's what the settlement says. I think there's a lot of skepticism, among everyone involved, if that's the way it's actually going to work.
So we were just talking about, I just talked to Brett Bielema the other day. He just did a little media scrum before singing at the Cubs game. And he was talking about this, like he's very optimistic that people will be in the same range, right? In the same payment range. But he was talking about the point that I think is going to be very, very relevant this year. Certainly when we see teams like, let's say, Texas Tech and some of the other like really big NIL collective spenders, that a lot of teams front loaded for this year, right? Like they were trying to get deals done before the settlement got approved, like the traditional collective deals that are, basically salaries, but not technically. So that they were trying to load up for this season. So you're going to have teams that are spending a lot more than $15 million on their football team this year. So like, I guess this is what you're saying, Justin, like, is it possible that they're going to pull that back? Right? Like, is that going to get regulated because schools can actually pay their players to play football versus like, well, if you pay someone $1 million this year, can you really pay them less than that next year if they have a good year?
Yeah, I think this is the big question. We even saw this, last season with Ohio State, where their AD announced they have a $20 million roster and they win the national championship. So again, are we now going to expect that Ohio State football is going to have a less expensive roster? Right. That's not the way it's worked in any industry. It hasn't worked with sports. It hasn't worked, with coaching salaries in sports or anything else. It's hard to kind of go backwards. And so I think that's the big question is there's these front loaded deals. So the salaries or the revenue sharing, however you want to put it, it's going to be a little inflated this year. Yeah. I think there was some good reporting that Missouri, which has a weird NIL situation, but they just spent over $30 million, on NIL last year. So now they're going to have $20 million or so. Again, it's hard to go backwards. So I think that's the biggest thing that the people are interested in is maybe the settlement will work and it'll kind of go as intended this season. But once you get into next year, and all these teams that, we're talking now about what players made, you're going to go to a player and say, hey, you're actually going to make 30% of what you made last year. That's going to be really tough. And I think it'll be interesting to see how these programs and players navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, that's been kind of the thing that I've been most interested in. I've talked to Nicole about this, but I'd love to get your thoughts because I don't think that anybody's going to go backwards. And it sounds like the idea is you supplement with the external NIL, but you have the clearinghouse that's standing in the way of that. You can't just put together these wild deals like we've seen over the last couple of years. So in terms of navigating the clearinghouse, have you heard what people are saying about that and how they're going to approach getting external NIL deals approved?
Yeah, I think part of it is no one actually knows how it's going to work. It has started, some people have started submitting deals, but instead, the whole idea of the clearinghouse is that the more deals that get submitted, it kind of learns and has an algorithm and it'll figure things out. So I think a lot of people are just curious, all right, if I submit this deal, what's the clearinghouse going to do? Is it going to deny it or is it going to pass? And I do think you might see a little bit of, testing things out and some people submitting deals, seeing if it gets approved. The interesting thing is, there is some responsibility for the schools, but players have to declare the deal. And so I know that there are a lot of GMs or programs that they haven't said, hey, don't submit your deals to the clearinghouse. They're not doing that, but maybe they're just not explaining exactly what this clearinghouse is. There are athletes that have no idea, oh, I just got a deal, I'm supposed to put it into this system, or maybe their agents aren't exactly explaining to them. And so that's why whether it actually works will be interesting. And maybe the unintended consequence of all of this, and I've heard some people mention, is like we might get the return of the bag man, right?
Yeah.
Back to the days of just paying players under the table, or getting through the agent now under the table. And because of the NIL collective landscape the past few years, it's actually kind of legitimized and streamlined this process. It's easier than it was before. So again, I don't know that anyone is like running out to just cheat and skirt the rules immediately. Maybe I'm naive and that's happening. I just think it's going to be a process over time of either athletes aren't declaring the deals that they get, or maybe they're not putting the full amount of the deal that they get in. Or it's just a situation where, it's like, hey, if you get a wire from a booster or someone that you worked with before in the NIL space, go on and live your life. And I know the settlement is set up to try and stop all of that. It's just, that's a lot of infrastructure to kind of put back into the tube when you hit a button and expect it to happen all immediately.
I mean, we're getting racketeering, we're getting wire fraud here. I mean, this feels like Teresa Giudice. I mean, this is where I like to live.
Oh, I know. Again, like Andy Cohen could really like make a killing if we get him like interviewing and getting some answers from like bagman players. Like, what did you really get? This game of telephone on how much these deals are. I mean, that's what I think is really interesting, right? Like as soon as there was a cap at first, the number was, or first the reaction, and like Justin, you talked about this, about where everyone's trying to save money because they have this new, it's like, oh my God, $20 million. Like that's a lot of money. And now we're already talking about like how to skirt it and how to get around it. Now the mechanism, like they're calling it NIL Go, which is kind of catchy, easy to remember. Deals that are over $600 are supposed to be submitted and approved. It's the way that the terminology that they used for like what they will approve is like, it has to have a business purpose, like that there has to be like an exchange of services. So you have to represent something or like do something with this marketing deal. And then also it has to be like within a reasonable range for services that are similar. Like there are some things that I think will be very easily approved, like a quarterback doing anything like that is legitimately like your name, image, and likeness, right? Like that's where like the idea of this came, where like Johnny Manziel was getting punished because he couldn't sign autographs. Like, no, everyone really wants a Johnny Manziel autograph. Like, there is true value there. The deal, like, give us an example of a deal that might have problems, like that might not get approved.
Yeah, it's honestly these deals that have gone through the collectives where you get a left guard and you're paying him $100,000 and he has to send some tweets saying how great the collective is. Like that's the stuff that isn't going to fly anymore, allegedly, under this clearinghouse. But again, there's going to be arguments. The whole question is, all right, if someone wants to pay a left guard $100,000, what is stopping them right now? It's going to be the settlement, but will that hold up? Will there be some legal challenges?
Is that like a reason? Is that like a true market value, or is that just like the argument against that is always the market's whatever someone's willing to pay you. But this is a weird convoluted space because money could not go to athletes for like the services, the actual like football talent and football playing. So it's like been a weird, like, I don't know, Joshua, like, how do you see this? Like, it's a weird way. Cause I know like in theory, it's whatever someone's willing to pay you. Great. That's what you're worth.
I mean, I would put it like this. Like, I think you would have to think about it in terms of an arm's length transaction. I sold real estate for a little while. So like transactions that got scrutinized were like, if I'm selling my house to my brother, right? Like that's not an arm's length transaction. So when other people are comparing deals, if we're doing appraisals, we would exclude that one because like our number could be whatever for that. So I'm almost thinking of it like, would somebody else pay a left guard $100,000 for 6 tweets if they weren't playing for them? And the answer is hell no, they wouldn't. And I think that kind of has to be mixed into the approach. Like, obviously, if you want to get a kid, you're going to do whatever you can to get them, but that's not what everybody else would do. That's not what a normal market would respond to. I'm very curious about that. And the other thing, and I'll throw this out here for the group, but like, I'm curious how the clearinghouse would look at a deal for the starting linebacker, will linebacker, who, you know, makes plays, but probably not the biggest name in Austin, Texas, versus that same player in Oxford, Mississippi, because now you're looking at demographic and market size. And does that play into how somebody would assess the value of a deal doing it in Austin versus doing it in Oxford?
And that's part of this, right? As they said, they're going to look at, you know, market and the program. And so, yeah, if you're a SEC quarterback, then you're going to have more marketability than a group of 6 cornerback. But who's to say, like, you know, what that difference is? And that's what all this is going to figure out. I think it's really interesting. I think the reason it's so interesting is because if you just lay all of this out, if you were to explain it to someone like, look, here's the way it's going to work. We're going to put these regulations in place. A lot of it is reasonable. I think a lot of it makes sense. I think a lot of it is stuff that people in college sports and fans have actually asked for and wanted for a long time. It's just completely different than the way things have worked the past few years or even longer. And so, yeah, if you just lay it out in a practical manner, people might say, yeah, that totally makes sense. But the first time that a coach doesn't get the player he wants, or the first time that a player gets a deal denied, then right. it's no longer hypothetical. Now it's like, how can this work? And that's where I think there's going to be problems. It sounds great in theory. Will it work in practice?
So this is where I am on this. And like, sometimes I end up like working myself into these takes and I'm like, am I like too defensive of the NCAA or like of rules in general, right? Like, because there haven't been a lot of rules around this for the last few years. But here's the thing, like, everyone has complained about the wild, wild west. Coaches have complained that, you know, it's frustrating to have to re-recruit your own rosters and have to negotiate even during the season or during the postseason with these players. So the idea of a school paying a player directly and cutting out the collective, like to try to, again, make these like fake deals of like, okay, well, you need to send 6 tweets and that's enough. Like, no, those were basically salaries for your football ability. Now you can pay directly from the school. You're cutting that out. Should be more direct, should be more fair. Isn't it up to the schools to actually be like, okay, this is what we asked for? Yes, like, we're fully supportive of this. Coaches too. Like, yes, we are going to follow the rules. We've been asking for this. We want this. And here is some structure around this. Like, to me, you got what you asked for. You got limits. You got rules. You have something that has to clear these things. We're going to get more information of like, here's the average deal for this position at this level. And now everyone's talking about skirting it. Like, to me, it's like, do what you asked for. Like, and if you do that, then there is structure.
No, I think you're right. And that's why I've talked to a lot of administrators or ADs or people that have been involved in putting this settlement together that have said that exact thing. Like, everyone complains that it's lawless and there's no regulation and we need rules and we need structure. Okay, we put it in place. Here it is. And that's why I do sympathize. There's a lot of people that have been frustrated by these quotes, whether it's from people in the industry, coaches, recruiting staffers, or agents, lawyers outside the industry that are basically undermining the settlement before it begins, because they're like, you asked us to do something, to put some regulations in place. We've done it. The problem, and the reason I see the other side, is they're different motivations, right? Like, I've used this example before. A head coach will never walk into an AD's office and hear, hey, I know you went 3-9 this year, but you followed the settlement to the letter of the law. You didn't break any of the rules. Here's your contract extension. That's not the way it works. The coach has to win. The recruiting staffers have to get the recruits. And so the motivations are a little bit different. And because for 100 years, it's been baked into the DNA of college sports, especially college football, that someone is finding the loophole. Someone's finding the recruiting advantage. And if you don't do it, they're going to beat you. It's just a tough thing to immediately flip this switch and be like, now there's rules, you have to follow them, and expect everyone to fall in line. So I totally sympathize with both sides.
Yeah, and I've talked to recruiting staffers. I feel like they're the ones getting the worst part of this, at least in the immediate aftermath, because kids are still coming on campus expecting it to be what it was for the last handful of years. Like you walk in and some dude from a collective comes up and is like, hey, here's your $250,000 contract, and there's no work attached to it, and nobody's going to tell you that you can't do this. They're trying on the fly to figure out how to communicate to high schoolers the impact of this and what it looks like and how they're going to navigate moving forward, because they still want to be able to get these kids deals too. It's the other part of it. I wanted to ask this though, because it sits in the back of my mind. Like I feel like non-revenue sports are just kind of like lost in the shuffle here, and nobody's talking about the potential impacts of that. And it's unfortunate. The other thing people aren't really talking about is how all of these changes would impact the group of five and how they navigate. So what's the G5 impact of the settlement?
Yeah, look, there's always been haves and have-nots in college sports, especially college football. I think especially here immediately in the next few years, that's just going to get even more obvious, that the haves and the have-nots. And part of that is power conference. Obviously these power conference schools have more money coming in. It's going to be easier to hit that rev share cap. But again, we're even now talking about those teams at the top of the SEC and the Big Ten that I think are going to separate even more so, because the financials are just so important right now with this revenue sharing, that the schools that have an easier time doing it, the schools that are able to go above that cap, whether it's above board or under the table, it's just going to be so much easier for them and create such a divide. So yeah, if you're a group of five, group of six school, whatever we're calling them now, or even if you're talking like mid-majors in basketball, I think it's always kind of been this way, but more so now you're competing against your conference as opposed to trying to compete on a bigger scale, because a lot of these schools can't hit that $20.5 million cap. So now you're saying all right, we can't get anywhere close to that, but can we spend a little bit more in rev share than these other teams in our conference? Can we beat them out for our recruits and try and win the conference and get to the playoff maybe, and collect that playoff money or whatever it looks like for them? But just that idea of hey, we're maybe going to be able to hang with some of these power conference teams, that was always a little bit of a pipe dream. To me, it just seems even more fantastical.
It's a really interesting point, because I feel like when coaches are taking jobs or weighing jobs, they're always looking at can I win my conference? What do the resources look like compared to everybody else? And now that being a piece of it, I mean, that's why we haven't gotten a ton of information. Some athletic directors have put out, hey, here are our percentages. This is what's going to football. This is what's going to men's basketball, women's basketball. We've had some schools that are doing money towards volleyball, gymnastics, hockey's gotten some, baseball, softball. That's something that's also really interesting to me, Justin, is there are some schools that are really good, powerhouse programs at a number of these other sports, the quote non-revenue sports. And some of them do bring in revenue, right? There's especially women's basketball's on growth potential, but I'm thinking of Oklahoma. Okay. So they of course have to give money to football. They of course have to give money to men's and women's basketball, but they have a softball dynasty. They're really, really good at gymnastics, baseball as well. You're in the SEC now. They've got a number of sports. So with some of these schools, you do have that cap. You have to divide that number. Are people making sure that they're getting money to these other sports? And what does that look like for the non-football basketball sports?
Yeah, I've talked to some athletic directors about this. I think you're going to see a lot of specializing and a kind of a lot of, having to winnow down and choose. You can't spread that $20.5 million to every sport. So, all right, you're doing football, men's and women's basketball, and then what? What are you most competitive at? For some schools it's wrestling, for some schools it's volleyball, for some schools it's softball. And maybe there's a school that's just really good in track and field and all right, we're actually going to give a little bit of money to that. I think that's great. It's going to help those programs continue to be competitive, but then you're not necessarily taking resources away from the other programs, but that's what's probably going to happen, because all right, if we're not giving any rev share to our tennis program, then it kind of becomes, all right, what's the point of us really investing a lot of money in our tennis program?
That's what I wanted to ask you, because we've seen a couple. So Washington State said, hey, we're going to do track, but not field.
Right.
So you're seeing people make those decisions on what is actually most important. But what does it look like for the other sports? The way I think of it is okay, maybe you have some scholarships. You're not at the maximum, but you're just kind of you're competing, but you're not competing, right? You're sponsoring it, but you're not contending for national championships or conference championships in those sports. Is that what it looks like for the sports that are not going to get the level of investment, the resources, if people divert it towards other sports?
Yeah, it's participating, but maybe not competing, right? And maybe you keep it as a varsity sport. And again, you have the scholarships, you have, all the things you would have before, but they're not getting the revenue sharing. And so you keep that going. But I do think at some point you're going to have decisions. These schools, these ADs are going to have to decide: is it worth it for us to keep funding this as a varsity sport if it's not going to be competitive and we're really not giving revenue sharing, or does it become club sports, or are some of these sports just kept so that you can meet the Title IX scholarship requirements? The one thing that if you ask ADs or people involved, none of them want to talk about cutting sports, eliminating sports, but they're all thinking about it. And, even if they're not just saying, hey, we're going to get rid of this program, they might just be kind of doing that in a way, in the sense that we're really not going to give the resources to it that we used to, or that it needs to be to remain competitive.
It's the one question that I've asked anytime I've gotten around an administrator is, are you going to cut sports, or what does that look like? Because I agree with both of you. And the idea that maybe you sponsor a sport, but it's not going to be competitive, I do think, especially with all the athletic departments going more toward like the business-minded administrator rather than somebody who came up in collegiate athletics, like it feels like they're just going to start cutting sports. They're going to be club sports, whatever the case is, which I think is a travesty. I had a lot of friends who played non-revenue sports in school, and like the benefit for them to be in that environment, what it did for them academically and in the future, is really tough here. The other thing I feel like we're kind of skirting around as we have these conversations is like other litigation. We've mentioned Title IX when it comes to that. I know there's a group of old heads like me that want to get a little cut of this money that they're back paying, but obviously there's a whole bunch of hold up to that. So like, what does the rest of the litigious world look like right now?
Yeah, everyone has said even those that have been the biggest supporters of the settlement, this doesn't solve all the problems. That's why there's still a lot of lobbying for Congress and federal legislation, because they realize this doesn't fix everything. It's interesting. There's been a lot of talk about what from the settlement might get, challenged in court or have lawsuits. There probably will be something. I'm starting to think that maybe the next thing will be something outside the settlement, right? So Title IX, they said all along, this is really not covered in the settlement. It's not part of it. We've seen some appeals, which I don't think those are going to go anywhere with the settlement, but I do think you're going to start to see some Title IX lawsuits, complaints pop up, whether it's on specific campuses or schools or whatever. That's going to be an issue. This talk about the transfer portal window, and do they go down to one transfer portal window? That's another thing that seems ripe for litigation. If, someone's going to say, hey, we didn't collectively bargain for you to remove a chance for player movement. And so, even just the whole employment collective bargaining argument is a little bit outside of the settlement. I'm starting to think that maybe the settlement might have been able to kind of put up shields for a lot of the litigation that it could face, the way it was structured. So maybe a creative lawyer will figure out a way, but I'm starting to think it's actually more likely Title IX, employment, something comes from the outside that is the next big fight that college sports has to deal with.
Yeah, I'm with you completely. Part of the reason, like, I think there are genuinely people, you mentioned like people who came up through college sports, like genuinely believe in the broad-based sports offerings. I think there were administrators that when this first came up, they said, okay, great, $20 million, 10 for women, 10 for men. And then very quickly it was like, nope, people are not going to do that. And if somebody else is doing $15 million for football, we have to do something similar to that, because you can't fall behind while there's a Title IX lawsuit for the next 3 years for 3 seasons, right? So that's part of the reason that number is so different. And we're seeing, 75%, like we're seeing different percentages because someone's going to get sued. Everyone's aware of that. But they can't fall behind in the meantime. So I think that's definitely going to come, the revenue sharing piece for Title IX. But I'm with you. I mean, I think employment and collective bargaining are still out there. It's different now than it was even a year ago, with like the National Labor Relations Board looking different and like the political environment being different. But I really think that like the whole play here for the NCAA, schools, conferences is, hey, look at what we just did. We're paying so much money to athletes and we're paying them moving forward now. Like, look at all these things we're doing. Can we get some antitrust protection? And if you look at pro sports, they have that, right? Like that allows them to have rules. Yes, they have collective bargaining, but there are certain things that are capped, right? You can't just pay Patrick Mahomes whatever the highest bidder is willing to pay him, right? Things that still exist in college. So I still think that's the main hope, right? And we've talked about this for 5 years of like, does Congress care? How important is this for them? But they're playing on the idea of like, look at what we just did. We did something on our own. We're not inept. We could have fought this tooth and nail in court, but we figured out a settlement and then see where it goes from there. But like the collective bargaining piece, like that's one where you're like, if you can get eventually to that, which it's very complicated to get to that, figuring out what the bargaining unit is, like that could take a very long time still. Then you're like, okay, we can have rules. But in the meantime, you're trying to figure out what you can have rules around schools that are opting in the settlement, agreeing to like not have their attorneys generals like file lawsuits to challenge a bunch of different things. Like that should help. But we'll see. I mean, I agree with you guys both. Like there's still going to be things that are challenged that make it hard to create actual structure around some of this stuff. The cap itself actually could get challenged, right? The 20 million. Why are you capping it at all? So there's a lot still.
And that's, the NCAA, part of the reason this whole settlement happened, NCAA and power conferences, because those are, they're together, but they're a little bit separate. But, the reason that they reached a settlement, one was because they didn't want to lose in court again. But the other reason, and I think Charlie Baker deserves some credit for this, is like for the long time, the NCAA was fighting against progress. And so now they've tried to do something. Whether it works, whether it's the best option, people can certainly argue over that, but they have done something, and now they're going to Congress, and they're on Capitol Hill saying, "We did something. Can you help us out now?" I do think, like, again, we're asking a lot for Congress to just step in and say, first of all, we want to fix your problems. Second of all, we're able to fix your problems. Like, good luck. We can stick to sports, but good luck. But I do think it'll be interesting because as you go down that road, I do feel like it's always going to lead back to someone's going to say, hey, the players, the athletes need a say in this. There needs to be, whether you're collective bargaining as employees or not as employees, I have a hard time believing that some big reset, some big overhaul can happen without someone saying we're going to have to bring everyone to the table. And so I think that's the next 5 years. Probably it's going to be really interesting to see what that looks like from a internal athletic sense, but also from a legal governmental sense.
I'll jump in real quick. I think if we do get to the point of collective bargaining, that is going to be a disaster. And the reason I say that is there's so many different interests that would have to be involved there. I'm curious how athletes and what the different units would look like, how they would come together for that. Second thing is the Congress thing, I think, is the one that a lot of us are looking at, because if you can get laws around things, it feels like it'd be simpler. But I'm not sure people are ready to reconcile with how their favorite politician would feel about labor and employment in the context of collegiate athletics. And that's kind of the big deal here too, is like there are different interests when it comes to politics and how they view what this ecosystem would look like. It's all really interesting to me.
Yeah, it is. And Justin, we have kept you long enough. We're going to have you come back and we'll do like a whole collective bargaining explainer because I think it is really, really interesting, but there's so many layers to it. We appreciate you coming, hanging out with us, explaining this and all the very interesting wrinkles. Justin Williams from The Athletic. You can read his work every day over there. Appreciate the time, bud.
Yeah, love the pod. Love you guys. I appreciate you having me.